Alrighty guys, good morning. We're gonna jump right into it. So I actually started working on the car a little bit before I started recording, but we're gonna be installing a raised subframe as well as new engine mounts to raise the engine as well. While I am under the car and I have the car apart, I did want to do a few other things. So far the lowering of the stock subframe is about ready to go. It's been pretty easy. So some of the bolts were deformed or scraped, as you can see here. Some of them were completely flat, but we got all those bolts removed, ready to go. We have the tie rod ends removed, the roll center adjusters removed from the front lower control arms. The front lower control arms are going to come down with the subframe along with the steering rack, and this process has just been going around the entire thing, making sure I have everything disconnected that's gonna snag or keep the subframe from lowering. Alright, so right now we're on the driver's side. Now I had to disconnect the wiring harness there for the O2 sensor. There's a connector there, as well as a little 10mm bolt right there. So I just had to remove those so I'm not pulling on that wire when I do lower the subframe. I have the rear bolts removed already. I also removed the support that runs underneath the radiator support. So that was just 4 17mm bolts as well as 2 17mm bolts that holds it to this front engine mount. I do also have the rear engine mount disconnected. So those bolts are going to be accessed through holes in the subframe. I did also have to disconnect the steering column bolt from the inside of the car, so that's right underneath the dashboard. There's a 12mm bolt underneath that plastic plate. Looks like the hardest part is going to be later. So one of the engine mounts I have to remove the inverter in order to access is right on this side, so we're going to do that later. And then the fourth and last engine mount is right here, so we're going to be replacing all 4 engine mounts as well as installing that raised subframe. I believe it's raised by 20 or 30mm, so once that's all said and done, we should have enough room to lower the car another inch or so. So going underneath the dashboard of the car, this is what I had to remove. So right here you can see the steering shaft, and then up here you can see where the steering shaft connects to the steering wheel. So I did mark it just in case I need to make sure it's realigned once I do install the new one. And I do have a shortened intermediate shaft that was sent to me by Carlos. I'll be sure to include his Fab Shop IG in the video. But he basically said that once I raise everything, the steering shaft will probably be too long. So he went ahead and made a shortened one for me that should work with the new setup. There's a few bolts that ended up looking like this when I did take them off. So luckily, most of the ones that were like this were super loose and I was actually able to undo them by hand. But if that wasn't the case, I'd probably have to cut the bolt head off or cut a slit in here so I could actually manually turn it with a different tool in order to remove these. Here is the subframe bolts for the rear, as well as some engine mount bolts and nuts. Those big bolts over there are the ones for the rear portion of the front lower control arm. So poor engineering from Toyota. This bolt for the front lower control arm you actually can't access. On this side it's blocked by the oil filter, but that's the reason I disconnected the front lowers from the RCAs, so that way I'll just lower the front lowers with the subframe, and then I'll be able to access that bolt and then move these lowers over to the new subframe. Shouldn't be too bad. Got my block of wood under here supporting the subframe, ready to lower it, and pretty much it'll just be these front 2 bolts holding it in. Once I remove those, it should drop freely. And then just as a recap, the rear subframe bolts are right there in that hole. But that's where we are currently at for the status. Here's the shortened intermediate shaft piece I was talking about earlier. That was shortened by Carlos. So they pulled this off one of the Priuses in the junkyard, and then they cut this portion shorter and re-welded it. So hopefully with that bolt disconnected underneath the dash, the subframe will drop freely and the intermediate shaft will pull out. I don't know how that's going to go, but we're going to find out. And then hopefully this new shortened shaft will work smoothly with the new setup. So once again, there is the bolt for the front of the subframe. So luckily there's a hole in the front lower control arm where we're going to be able to put our socket through in order to access. And then this is just going to be a 19mm bolt. Alright, so we took the front two bolts out and we are currently lowering the subframe. So what I went ahead and did is actually went inside the car really quick and then wiggled that intermediate shaft off. So hopefully that'll drop with no problem once the subframe starts coming down. Alright, so here's where we're currently at. The intermediate shaft started coming through the boot for the firewall, so that's good. I can see now that this is the piece I'm supposed to be replacing with that shorter one that Carlos made me. So I'm just trying to figure out right now if I should continue lowering this and then try to pull the rest of this intermediate shaft out, or if maybe I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect it here so that I can get the subframe out. But everything's looking good. Looks like I snagged this a little bit, but oh, it's good to go. So be sure to disconnect all that stuff before you lower the subframe. So I did lower the subframe a little bit more, but some of the intermediate shaft is still inside that boot. So what I'm probably going to do now is mark the position of where this is, take out this bolt, disconnect this shaft, and then I should be able to get the subframe out completely. When disconnected the intermediate shaft, and this boot ended up falling out with it. But now that is clear of the subframe and this is completely free to maneuver. So once we get this out, I'm gonna move all this stuff over to the new subframe, and then we'll get that one into position. Here is the stock subframe side by side with the new subframe. So you can see where they raised it by cutting down those mounting points. So that's in the front as well as in the rear. You normally have this tube sticking up here, but it looks like they cut it shorter and then also welded this plate over it. So I went ahead and reconnected the new intermediate shaft piece using that marking we had made earlier. So this should be aligned. I'll have to go through and make sure everything else is aligned when the time comes. But now the process is going to be moving over all the stuff from the stock one over to the new one. So that's going to be the front lower control arms, the steering rack, and then this bracket here for the O2 sensor. So here's an update since it's been a couple hours. I moved the front lower control arms over to the new subframe as well as that bracket. So these front lower control arms were super difficult to get out of the stock subframe. I basically just had to stick a pry bar in there and stand on top of it until I could pry it out. But as for the steering rack, the bolts and nuts that I had for holding the steering rack down were actually scraped a little bit too bad. So I'm gonna go to the hardware store and pick up some new bolts for that. But once we get that steering rack inside, we should be good to go.
So the torque spec for these two are 102 foot-pounds, and the torque spec for these two are 172 foot-pounds.
Alright, so everything has been installed to the subframe. This is basically ready to go back into the car. So one of the things I'm actually going to be doing next week is extending the threads on these subframe bolts. So as you can see here, with the subframe being shortened, there's actually some unthreaded portion of the bolt poking through the mounting point. So with that happening, I'm actually not going to be able to thread those bolts in. Now, one of the options is to use washers, something like this. Now this would actually work for the front, but it wouldn't work for the rear because then the bolts would just hang lower, even lower than the subframe itself, which would kind of defeat the purpose. So my neighbor is going to be hooking me up with the M14 die next week, and then we're going to go ahead and extend the threads further down the shank so that we can fully thread these bolts when the time comes. So in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and swap out the two engine mounts that I can reach. So I got that rear one right there, and then I have the front one right there. And then these are the new mounts here. So this will be the front, and then this will be the rear. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the front engine mount. So this is the one that's going to be going right behind the radiator. So right now we're gonna keep both engine mounts loose so that we can kind of move them around as needed when we put the subframe up. Now if you look right up here, you can see the bottom nut for the engine mount on the upper passenger side. So that's one of the mounts that we'll have to be replacing, but we want to make sure it's supported by the subframe first before we go removing any engine mounts, because as you can see, this engine is very loose without the lower mounts attached. So we'll get the subframe in place to hold it as we work on the upper mounts. And then for this mount up here, we are going to have to remove the inverter on the top side in order to access this. So we are at the front of the car now. We're going to try to take out this engine mount and then save this one for last, since we're going to have to remove the inverter to get to it. Alright, I'm going to call it a night. So we got the new engine mount in on this side. Still got to do that other side. So my biggest recommendation is to just take this intake resonator box that sits right here and just take it off, completely throw it away because it's pointless. And in doing that, you will gain a whole lot of access to everything else in the engine bay. So I had a lot of hard time, lots of tight spaces, hard to work with. But this is the intake resonator box, and I'm definitely gonna throw that in the trash.
We are now putting back the inverter.
Perfect. So for an update, we got both of the top two motor mounts fully installed and torqued. Went ahead and dropped the subframe again now that the engine is being held up by the two new motor mounts. So next week is when I'm supposed to be able to finish up these bolts, extend the threads so that these can fully thread into the mounting points on the new subframe. But in the meantime, I'm basically going through and installing my new 3-inch springs on the front coilovers. So I already got this side done. I'm gonna go ahead and do this side now. And then for the rears, I have enough room to just lower those another inch to match the front. And yeah, just doing other things in the meantime while we wait for these subframe bolts. So here are the clamps we ended up using on the exhaust to help raise it from the ground a little bit. The stock hangers were getting scraped, so hopefully this will give me a little bit more ground clearance. Not much to say here, just that I went ahead and extended the threads on these bolts, so now they should thread fully and seat that subframe. Well, it's been a painful couple weeks, but we finally got the subframe reinstalled with the modified bolts. So now everything's fully buttoned up. We got the suspension reconnected, tie rods. But my coilover is currently seized up here. So I'm gonna have to figure out a way to break that loose in order to get that readjusted. And then we got the skid plate. And you can definitely see that the oil pan is a lot higher in relation to the skid plate now. So even though those mounting points for the subframe also moved up a bit, raised the engine a good amount, so should be good to go.
Hey guys, so the Prius is pretty much, for the front end is all put back together. We did raise the subframe and engine about an inch, and then we did lower the car an inch. We also did a intake resonator delete. This is how the 1-inch lowering looks on the carbon head violators.